the book Rays of the One Light, Weekly Commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Ananda. Week 31, How Democratic is Truth? Truth is one and eternal. Realize one with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. We live in an age when people assume that knowledge should be available equally to all. In matters susceptible of judgment by normal common sense, however, everyone knows there are exceptions. Access to a control room for intercontinental missiles is limited by universal consent to a very few. Access to the controls of a passenger airline is limited to those with the necessary knowledge for operating them, and also to those with the proper authorization. If people don't see the disadvantages of making more subtle knowledge universally available, it is only because they're ignorant of the risks involved. In the case of subtle knowledge, the main disadvantage in making it universally available is the harm it may do to one who isn't ready for it and who might even mock it. True, by mocking truth, he might undermine the faith of a few true seekers. But then such tests can also be beneficial as a means of strengthening faith. Again, true, the clever doubter's misrepresentation of those truths may dissuade a few seekers from following the spiritual path. But if a seeker really is sincere, he will recognize the truth eventually because it resonates with him in his own being. No, the greatest problem accrues to the shallow doubter himself. To give him an opportunity to affirm his ignorance might only estrange him even more from the truth, delaying the time when he will turn, as all people must, eventually, to the light. Thus, the scriptures advise not secrecy, but discretion in the sharing of truth. Jesus Christ says in the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 7, "Give not that which is holy unto dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again and rend you." And Sri Krishna says in the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, "Never speak of these truths to one who is without self-control or devotion, who renders no service, who does not care to hear, or who speaks ill of me." Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Oh. Oh. Oh.
Good morning. Happy to see some old friends here that we haven't seen in a while. It's lovely to see you. We're going to start with our reading from Whispers from Eternity, Yogananda's beautiful book of spiritual poems and prayer demands. And today we'll read number 2. We demand of thee as thy children. Thou art our Father. We are made in thine image. We are thy children. We neither ask nor pray as beggars, but demand of thee as thy children the gifts of wisdom, salvation, health, happiness, and eternal joy. Whether naughty or good, we are still thy children, all of us. Help us to perceive and understand inwardly thy will for us. Teach us the independent use of our human will, since thou gavest it to us to use freely, attuned to thy wisdom-guided will. So, we are children of God. Isn't that something to rejoice in? No matter what happens in our lives, no matter what happens in the world around us, whether we have heartbreak or physical illness or whatever, we are children of God, and God loves us unconditionally, no matter what. And as children of God, spiritual truth is our birthright. It's our divine inheritance. So that's what God is offering to us. All the spiritual truth of the universe, he's offering us, or she's offering us self-realization And the way that the spiritual law of the universe works is that we receive what we can, depending on where we are on the continuum of spiritual development. So it's very fair, isn't it? That we receive what we're able to receive. It's really about receptivity. And the more that we bring our awareness and our attention and our love to God, the more our heart bursts wide open and the more we receive. And the more we receive, the more we can share with other people. You know, from incarnation to incarnation, we come and we learn these lessons and we take something with us each time. So when we come back the next time, we have more of availability of this ray of God's light. So we know that we wouldn't teach a little kindergartner algebra 2 or geometry. I mean, I can barely do that myself. So we wouldn't start out that way with a little child. And it's the same way with spiritual truth and subtle truth, that we start out with the basics, and each incarnation we learn more and more. There's a wonderful story. There are prodigies, of course. There's prodigies in music and math and different things. And in spirituality, sometimes little babies are born in India and they recognize them as a Bodhisattva from a previous life. There's a wonderful story that Yogananda tells of a very ancient sadhu who, passing a funeral pyre in India, saw the body of a 6-year-old boy who had passed. And he said, "Stop, don't burn that body." And he dropped dead and he went into the body of the little boy and jumped off and ran into the woods. So imagine how shocking that is, because he felt that he needed more time in this incarnation to learn more lessons. And so this is the blessing of our life. When things get really hard and things are tough, just remember that that's a gift to us from God, that we can expand our awareness and expand our ability to receive God's truth and God's wisdom. So everything that comes to us is a blessing. And this incarnation, our life, is the place where we learn. You know, Master said we can learn in the astral world as well, but not as quickly as we learn in the physical world. And that's why when we leave this incarnation, most of us, unless we reach self-realization, are eager to come back and start again at a higher level of understanding, so that eventually we don't have to do that. Good thing to remember, right? When things are tough, because things are tough sometimes. Jesus often said, "He that have ears to hear, let them hear." So Jesus's teachings, the deeper teachings, were intended for higher levels of consciousness, but also anything that he said could touch people at the level they were at. So again, Jesus's teachings were very universal, but he did know that there were people at that time who had a deeper, higher understanding of truth. And those were the people that he attracted to him, his closest disciples, of course. And the universal law of God allows us to arrive at truth at our own speed. So that's just perfect, isn't it? We just arrive at truth at our own speed. There's no rush. Just take time, spend time in meditation, loving God, and everything will happen as it's supposed to. When Yogananda came to America, he understood that, and he really came with that concept of receptivity. He came to an American audience, a foreign land. Even when he designed his churches, he put chairs in the churches because he knew Americans couldn't sit on the ground in lotus position. So he was very thoughtful in the way that he presented his teachings. And he realized quickly when he came to Boston in 1920 that there were several trends happening at that time, and he tuned right into what was capturing the imagination of Americans at that time. And he met Dr. Lewis's wife, Mildred. She was one of the first people he met at a talk given by the leader of the local Rosicrucian order. And shortly after that, he met Alice Hazy, who later became Sister Yoga Mata. And they were part of a group of women in Boston who were interested in higher truth and in metaphysics. They were always going to different lectures, and they were very curious, and they were very excited to meet Yogananda because here was this, man from the West who had higher knowledge. They were looking for something more than they'd been raised with because they had outgrown it at that time, but they couldn't really put their finger on what it was. So one of the big trends at the time was transcendentalism. That was huge on the East Coast because of Henry David Thoreau, and before him, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And transcendentalism came originally from Hindu scriptures from the Vedas. That was the inspiration, and it made a lot of different routes through Europe and different ways of kind of taking that knowledge and, different people making it their own. But that was big in Boston at the time. And the other thing was physical fitness, which sounds really funny, but in 1920, a very famous gymnast came through Boston, and he talked about how important it was to keep the body physically fit. And people wanted to improve their bodies. They wanted to improve their well-being through exercise and gymnastics and that type of thing. So, Master understood that some people would be attracted to the higher metaphysical part of his teachings, but other people would be really interested in energization exercises and in yoga asana and how that could help our bodies. So he really tailored his talks to the audience that he was serving at that time in each situation. And there's a 1923 Boston Post article about Yogananda, and the author of the reporter focused on, the reporter from the newspaper focused on the Yogata method, which later Master called energization exercises. And in the article, he talked about them as revolutionizing all systems of exercise, that it'll take fat off at will and perhaps even eliminate the need for drugs. So that's pretty good. And, truthfully, it's probably true. If we were doing them correctly, we could, because it really is concentration and willpower. And if we bring one pointed focus to anything we do, we manifest it. So he did have a point there. And although the article did acknowledge Yogananda was a philosopher and a mystic who did come to America to teach higher truths, most of the article was about the physical attributes of yoga. And that was because that was the reporter's understanding. That was his level of understanding. When he went to Master's lecture, he didn't pick up on the philosophy or the higher truth of self-realization. He picked up on the physical aspects of yoga, which is fine. Yogananda went to Carnegie Hall in 1926. And it's such an interesting story. He filled the auditorium, as we know. I think there were over 3,000 people, and there were people lined up on the sidewalks. He'd been in America then by 6 years, so people had heard of him. And we have to assume that a large part of that audience was an intellectual audience from New York City. There may have been some spiritual seekers, of course, but instead of Master coming up with a 2-hour talk about yogic philosophy, he came out and sat on stage and chanted, "Oh God, beautiful," for 90 minutes. Oh God, beautiful. Now, what happened that night is that the people in the audience who were able to receive the higher vibration of Master, they went into spiritual euphoria. They had an experience of God. There were people there who had maybe broken hearts in this lifetime. They had sadness and love. Their hearts were broken right wide open into God's love, and they cried. There were people who were weeping. There were people, like in today's reading, who were, what was the term? You'll have to remind me, Jean, the doubters. There were 2 different types of doubters. There were the shameless doubters and the half doubters. So there were different levels of people that were just there because they were doubters and they wanted to see what this was all about. And even those people left scratching their head thinking, what just happened to me? That's how powerful it was. And Master, of course, was omnipresent. He knew what he was doing. And the whole purpose of him doing that was when he went out into that audience, he read that vibration of the room. And he knew that each one would receive what they could receive, according to their level of receptivity. But he also knew that he was tilling the soil. He was preparing all those hearts and souls for the next level on their spiritual path. And many people from that night right away joined the lessons. They signed up for Yogananda's lessons and they started their journey of self-realization. So isn't that powerful? And we touched that a little bit today, didn't we? When Duty was singing, "I want only thee, Lord." It's such a powerful chant. That's all we're saying over and over. I want only thee, Lord. I want only thee. I don't know about you, but I could feel my heart start to vibrate. And if we had done that for another hour, we'd all be crying in divine ecstasy. So it's just a good thing to remember in our own practice at home. Like, chanting is a powerful way to cut through the junk in our minds, because sometimes you sit to meditate and your mind just you kind of can't get through it sometimes. But if we just start by chanting, even if you're walking around the house doing housework, doing your chanting before you meditate, it makes a difference. So just a nice little reminder. So again, receptivity, there's no reason to push someone beyond their readiness. There's just no reason to do that, because again, the more we tune into God, the more our hearts open and the more we receive. It's the divine law. I just want to say one more thing. So everyone here has read the autobiography of a yogi, and it's so great. You can ask each other later, but to listen to people's stories about how the book came to them and what happened. And it's different for everybody. And one common thread for many, many people, they received the book, but they couldn't read it at first. Maybe they started to read a little bit, but then they put it away. And then later, and then there was at some point when we were ready, myself included, we opened that book up and it was like, bam, right? You couldn't put it down. So, not everybody had that experience, but many, many people have had that experience. And many people, once they become disciples of Yogananda, they recall different periods of their life where Yogananda came to them in different ways, through a photograph or through a quote or through someone else who was already on the path that really touched them. So, it's interesting how the guru is constantly weaving that vibration through our hearts and minds. And as soon as we're ready, we receive. Today's Bhagavad Gita reading, Krishna counsels us to never speak of these truths to one who is without self-control or devotion, who renders no service, who does not care to hear, or who speaks ill of me. It's so interesting that he phrased that in sort of a negative, instead of saying you need to have devotion. But he said, if you don't have devotion, don't tell these people, or if they don't render service. And starting out with one who's without self-control. So Swami Kriyananda used to say that the mind of one without self-control is like a milk pail with holes in it. And no matter how much milk you pour in it, you can't hold anything. So self-control is really a major part of our practice. All of our techniques are directly related to self-control, controlling the thoughts, learning to control the energy in the body, learning to control even the energy in the heart. Lack of self-discipline and self-control makes us restless. And God doesn't come to us when we're restless. We have to be silent and still. It's in the still, quiet heart that God comes to us when we least expect it. So it's really important. And one without devotion, no matter how intelligent a person may be, without devotion, we can't take one step on the spiritual path. And Yogananda knew that when he chanted at Carnegie Hall. He probably read that crowd as a very, again, intellectual crowd. And he knew what he needed to do is to touch their heart. And that's why he chose to do that day. Just as a radio program, you can't listen to a radio program unless you tune the dial to that station. We can't receive God's truth or God's love unless we attune our channel to God's vibration through our line of gurus or any of the other great masters. One who renders no service. This whole path is one of service. The God in me serves the God in you. No matter what that means, in any little way, opening the door for someone, helping them with their groceries. If someone's having a hard day, picking up the phone and just saying, I'm thinking of you. There's so many different ways that we can do that. And then one who doesn't care to hear. That's an interesting one. One who doesn't care to hear, about God's truth. Well, if we turn that around, we can say, how badly do we want God? How badly do we want that? The greater the longing for God in our own hearts, the more perfectly and completely God's effulgence is revealed to us. So again, the more we want God, the more completely and perfectly God's effulgence is revealed to us. There's a story of a boy who went to a saint to learn about God from him. And this is a terrible thing, but the saint took him down to the lake and put his head under the lake until the boy was kicking and flailing and couldn't breathe. And then he let him up and he said to him, what did you just want more than anything else? And the boy cried, air, air. And he said, don't come back to me until you want God just as much as you felt you wanted the air. So that's how much we have to want God for God to really come to us in a powerful way, to really change our lives. So we're so lucky on this path of self-realization because Yogananda has given us the keys to the kingdom. He really doesn't hide anything from us, does he? He gives it all to us right up front, more or less. It's just our job to go deeper and deeper and deeper over the years to open up more and more and more. And I'm going to use Whispers as an example. This beautiful book. So today, after the offertory, Duty is going to sing the Om song, which is a poem in the book. And when you read that beautiful poem, it's lovely. It's a lovely piece of literature. But until you hear the Om sound in meditation, until you hear the bumblebee in the first chakra, until you feel the gong or the bell in the heart when your heart breaks open, it doesn't mean as much, does it? But when you have those inner experiences, that poem has a different meaning. So Master gives us the answers. He gives us that information. But until we are receptive, until we actually do the practices, we spend time in silence and communion with God, then we can't understand all of it. So it is very democratic in a sense. Here it is. It's all here for you. Even Kriya Yoga. Once you, of course, just like we start out as children learning basics, we start out learning all the basics on the path to Kriya Yoga. We take several classes. We learn about the energy in the spine, the Sushumna, all of the words that are foreign to us when we first start. But until we actually start to do the Kriya practice year after year after year, it doesn't really have the same effect until we have the direct experience of that energy. So that's what this path is. Self-realization through our own effort, through our devotion and love to God, through feeling God's vibration moving through us, through practicing Hangsa, practicing our Kriyas, chanting, we start to change on a molecular level, one cell at a time. And the wonderful thing about this path, every year we kind of have different spiritual birthdays, like maybe the date that you became a disciple, you took your discipleship, or the day that you became initiated as a Kriyaban. You can use those spiritual birthdays to kind of reflect back, and you'll see year after year the progress that you're making. Sometimes you don't notice it day by day, but you do notice it when you start to compare over the years. So I'll leave that thought with you, and we'll have our offertory, and then Duti's going to lead us through this beautiful song, the Om song, and just listen to the words. It talks about the experience of the holy Om vibration moving through the energy centers in our body. Om, peace.